Hello, everyone. We've all seen the paintings, grand wooden ships with billowing white sails, slicing through a turquoise sea under a brilliant sun. Men like Columbus and Magellan stand proudly on the quarterdeck, gazing toward a new horizon, the very picture of heroic ambition. This is the age of discovery as it's sold to us, a glorious adventure, a triumph of the human spirit. But that picture is a lie. It's a carefully crafted fantasy designed to hide a much darker, filthier, and more terrifying truth. The truth is, for the 99% of men who sailed on those voyages, the ones whose names are lost to history, these ships were not vessels of discovery. They were floating prisons, they were wooden coffins, packed to the brim with desperation, disease, and death. So what was it like to spend months, even years, trapped inside one of these creaking, groaning cages, with nothing but a few planks of wood between you and the abyss? Forget the grand maps and the royal decrees. We're going to talk about the things they didn't write down: the smell, the taste of rot in your mouth, the constant, gnawing hunger, and the creeping madness that came with it. This is the story of rum, hardtack, and live pigs. Before the anchor was even weighed, the first assault on the senses began. Imagine a space smaller than a modern-day school bus, and now cram 90 men into it. Not for an hour, but for months. The air itself became a thick, living thing, a foul cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale bilge water, sea salt, tar, and the ever-present eye-watering stench of livestock. Yes, livestock, pigs, chickens, they were the ship's fresh meat supply, a walking larder, but they were also a source of unimaginable filth. Their waste would mix with the seawater that constantly washed over the decks, creating a slick, stinking slurry that coated everything. The grunts and squeals of the pigs became part of the ship's horrifying symphony, a constant reminder of the squalor you called home. The ship itself, a carrack or a caravel, was a masterpiece of its time. But it was no palace. It was a thing of constant jarring motion. It didn't sail, it wallowed, it rolled and pitched with a sickening, unpredictable rhythm that never, ever stopped. For a new sailor, the first few weeks were a living hell of seasickness. You'd retch until there was nothing left but bitter bile. Your body ached. The boatswain's rope didn't care if you were dizzy. You learned to live with emotion, to walk with a permanent sway, to sleep in snatches as the world lurched beneath you. Sleep. Where did you sleep? There were no bunks, no cabins for the common sailor. You found a patch of deck, hopefully one that wasn't directly under a leaking seam or next to the pigpen, and you collapsed. You slept in your wet, salt-stiffened clothes, curled up against a cannon or coiled ropes, your body pressed against dozens of other men. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Every cough, every groan, every nightmare, fueled shout was a public event. The darkness below deck was absolute. The only light came from a few swaying, stinking lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows. The air down there was even worse, thick with the smell of rot and decay, completely stagnant. This was your world, a cramped, noisy, stinking, perpetually moving cage, and the voyage had only just begun. The sun would rise, painting the sky in glorious colors that you were too exhausted to appreciate. The day's work began before dawn and ended long after dusk, a relentless cycle of toil that was... The ship was a living thing, and it demanded constant sacrifice. At the heart of it all was the rigging, a spiderweb of hundreds of ropes, thicker than a man's arm, all coated in sticky black tar. Your life depended on knowing every single one by touch, even in the pitch black of a stormy night. You'd haul on them until your hands were raw and bleeding, the coarse hemp fibers grinding into your skin. Up the ratlines you'd scramble, 100 feet above a churning sea, with nothing but a flimsy rope between you and oblivion. The ship would be rolling violently, the mast swaying in a dizzying arc. One slip, one moment of lost concentration, and you were gone. No one would even try to rescue you. The ship couldn't turn around quickly enough. A man overboard was a man already dead, his screams swallowed by the wind. His mates would say a quick prayer, and then someone would be ordered to collect his meager belongings. Life was cheap. Then there was the pump. Every wooden ship leaked. It was a fact of life. Water seeped in through 1,000 tiny gaps in the hull, collecting in the bilge at the very bottom of the ship. This bilge water wasn't just seawater. It was a vile soup of everything that had been spilled or discarded. Rotten food, it festered in the darkness, releasing a poisonous, sulphurous stench that could knock a man unconscious. Twice a day, every day, a team of sailors had to man the pump, a back-breaking contraption that sucked this foul liquid out of the ship's belly and spewed it back into the sea. It was the most hated job on the ship, a grueling two-horror ordeal that left you exhausted and stinking of pure decay. The work was endless, scrubbing the decks with salt water and sand, patching the sails with a needle and palm, reinforcing the hull, checking the cargo. There was always something that needed mending, something on the verge of breaking. The ship was in a constant state of decay, and your labor was the only thing holding it together against the relentless power of the ocean. And for this, what were you given? What fuel did you have for this unending toil? The answer lay in the ship's stores, in a trinity of despair: hardtack, salted meat, and foul water. Let's talk about hardtack. The name itself is a warning. It wasn't bread, it was a simple biscuit made of flour, water, and maybe a little salt, baked until it was as hard and dense as a brick. It was baked to last for years, and it did. The problem was, to even attempt to eat it, you had to break it apart with a mallet or soak it for an hour in whatever liquid you had. But the real horror of the hardtack was not its consistency. It was its inhabitants. Every barrel of biscuits was a thriving ecosystem for weevils. When you broke open a piece of hardtack, the inside would often be a moving mass of black insects and their larvae. Sailors had a grim saying: you'd tap the biscuit on the table to knock out some of the living residents. Then you'd dunk it in your grog or soup and eat it quickly before you could see what was still crawling around inside. This was your primary source of carbohydrates. This was your daily bread. Then there was the meat, barrels of salted beef or pork, preserved in a thick layer of brine. When the barrel was opened, the smell could make you gag. The meat was often a sickly color, green or gray, and the texture was like old leather. It was so salty that it had to be soaked in water for hours before it could be cooked. But that did little to improve the taste. Sometimes it was so rotten that it would glow in the dark with phosphorescence. The sailors called this the sea fire. A beautiful name for a disgusting reality, but the most dangerous thing you consumed was the water. Algae would grow, turning the water green and slimy. It would become stagnant and thick, tasting of the barrel's wood and rot. The sailors called it stinking water. They would try to make it palatable by mixing it with wine or rum. But they had no choice but to drink it. It was a breeding ground for bacteria, a fast track to dysentery, the bloody flux which could kill a man in a matter of days through dehydration, and life became a grim calculus of survival. Was the hunger worse than the risk of eating the crawling biscuit? Was the thirst worse than the risk of drinking the slimy water? Every meal was a gamble, and in this world of relentless labor and wretched sustenance, a rigid, brutal hierarchy was the only thing preventing total chaos. At the top of this wooden world was the captain. He was a god. His word was law. He and his officers lived in the stern castle, a separate structure at the back of the ship. It wasn't luxurious by our standards, but compared to the crew's quarters, it was a palace. They had private cabins, ate better food off pewter plates, and drank finer wine. They were a class apart, and they rarely mingled with the common sailors, except to give orders or mete out punishment. The gap between the officers and the crew was a motley collection of men from the gutters of Europe. Desperate peasants, escaped criminals, debtors, and a few foolish young men who had been seduced by tales of gold and glory. They were considered expendable, a resource to be used up and replaced. Discipline was not maintained through respect. It was maintained through fear. The boatswain and his mates were the enforcers, large, hardened men who carried a starter, a short, knotted piece of rope. Any sailor deemed to be moving too slowly or showing a hint of insolence would feel the sting of that rope across his back. It was a casual, everyday brutality. For more serious offenses, the punishments were medieval in their cruelty. A thief might have his hand nailed to the mast. A man who fell asleep on watch could be tied to the mast and have buckets of seawater thrown on him until he was half drowned and hypothermic. The ultimate punishment short of hanging was keel-hauling. The offender would be tied to a rope, thrown overboard on one side of the ship, and dragged under the hull to the other side. If the speed of the ship didn't drown him, the razor, sharp barnacles encrusting the bottom of the ship would. They would shred his skin and flesh from his bones. Few men survived it, and those who did were scarred for life, both physically and mentally. This constant threat of violence created a tense, paranoid atmosphere. Men who had to trust each other with their lives in a storm would betray each other for an extra ration of rum. Friendships were temporary. Alliances were fragile. The only thing that truly united them was a shared mutiny. Was the great, unspoken fear of every captain. It simmered beneath the surface of every long voyage, a spark of rebellion that could be fanned into a flame by a particularly cruel officer, a reduction in rations, or the simple, crushing despair of being lost at sea. Most mutinies were disorganized, desperate acts that were quickly and ruthlessly crushed. The ringleaders would be hanged from the yardarm, their bodies left to swing in the wind as a grim warning to the rest of the crew. But the threat was always there, a testament to the fact that you could only push desperate men so far before they decided they had nothing left to lose. Yet, even in this brutal world, there were moments of strange beauty and camaraderie. When the work was done and the weather was fair, men would gather on. They would sing sea shanties, songs of home, of lost loves, and of the hardships of the sea. They would tell stories, tall tales of mermaids and sea monsters, spinning yarns to pass the endless hours, and there was rum or grog, a mixture of rum and water. The daily ration was the highlight of the day, a brief moment of warmth and oblivion. It was a medicine against the cold, a painkiller. For a few precious minutes, the fiery liquid would burn away the misery, and a man could almost forget where he was. The purser would ladle out the ration under the watchful eye of an officer, and the men would down it in one go. It was a ritual, a sacred moment in a profane existence. But this small comfort was a double-edged sword. Drunkenness was a serious crime, and the officers used the rum ration as another tool of control, withholding it as punishment and creating jealousy and resentment. It was a small mercy granted by the same men who held the power of life and death over them. As the weeks turned into months, a new enemy would emerge, an enemy far more terrifying than a cruel boatswain or a raging storm. It was a feeling of profound lethargy, aches in the joints, a general sense of malaise. Then the gums would begin to swell and turn a dark purplish color. They would bleed at the slightest touch. Old wounds, even those that had been healed for years, would mysteriously reopen. Teeth would loosen in their sockets until they could be pulled out with the fingers. Large, dark bruises would appear on the skin, and the legs would swell. The plague of the sea for centuries. No one knew what caused it. They blamed it on bad air, on laziness, on a lack of morale. They didn't understand that it was a simple, brutal deficiency of vitamin C, on a diet of nothing but hardtack and salted meat. The body's store of this vital nutrient would be depleted, and the body would literally begin to fall apart. Collagen, the connective tissue that holds the body, would begin to disintegrate from the inside out. The suffering was unimaginable. Men would lie in their hammocks, too weak to move, their breath foul with the smell of decay. They would moan in agony as their joints swelled and their skin rotted. It was a slow, gruesome death, and it was terrifyingly common. On some voyages, more than half the crew would be lost to scurvy. A ship could become a ghost ship, still sailing but with a crew of dead and dying men, too weak to even work the sails. Imagine the psychological horror. You watch your friends, men you've worked and suffered with, slowly decay before your eyes, and you absolutely know, that the same mysterious illness is inside you, waiting to claim you next. You feel the first signs, the weakness in your limbs, the tenderness in your gums, in a cold. There is no escape. You are trapped on a floating graveyard. The officers were not immune, though their slightly better diet often delayed the onset. A wise captain knew that scurvy was a greater threat than any enemy fleet. They would desperately search for land, any land, in the hopes of finding fresh greens or fruits that could miraculously bring their men back from the brink of death. When they finally found it, men who were on the verge of death would be carried ashore, and after a few days of eating fresh fruit, they would begin to recover. It must have seemed like a miracle, a divine intervention, further deepening the mystery of the dreaded disease. But land was not always a salvation, and the sea itself had its own furies. We think of storms today as something to be tracked by satellites and avoided. In the 15th, the first sign would be a change in the color of the sky, a darkening on the horizon, a strange new sound to the wind. Experienced sailors would feel it in their bones. A frantic energy would seize the ship, orders would be shouted, their sounds almost lost in the rising howl of the wind. All hands on deck, strike the topsails, furl the mainsail. The crew would scramble into the rigging, fighting against a wind that was trying to... The sails, huge sheets of canvas, would become monstrous, thrashing beasts, capable of breaking a man's arm with a single flap. They had to be wrestled into submission, tied down with thick ropes, while the ship began to pitch and roll violently. Then the rain would come, not as drops, but as a solid wall of water, blinding and cold, and then the waves. Mountains of dark water, rising up on all sides, lifting the tiny ship to their terrifying peaks before dropping it into a deep trough, with a sickening crash that shuddered through every timber. The world would become a churning chaos of wind, water, and noise. The roar of the storm was deafening, a physical presence that crushed the spirit. The ship would groan and creak under the strain, the wooden planks bending, the masts threatening to snap. Every man knew that the ship could break apart at any moment, spilling them all into the furious black water. Below deck was a special kind of hell. In the pitch black, men and unsecured cargo would be thrown from one side of the hold to the other. The sounds were terrifying, the shriek of the wind, the crash of the waves against the hull, and the splintering sound of the ship's timbers straining against the sea. Water would pour in through the hatches and seams, and the men at the pumps would have to work for their very lives, a desperate, losing battle against the ocean. Storms could last for days. There was no sleep, no hot food, just a constant, exhausting fight for survival. You would be soaked to the bone, cold and terrified, living on raw nerve and adrenaline, and you would pray to every god and saint you could remember. You would make bargains with the heavens, promising a lifetime of piety if you could just see one more sunrise. When the storm finally broke, the silence that followed was just as unnerving. The ship would be battered, sails torn, maybe a mast lost. The crew would be... They had stared into the abyss and survived. This shared experience forged a bond stronger than any friendship. They had faced death together. But the respite was temporary. The work of repairing the ship would begin immediately, and the memory of the storm would linger, a constant reminder of their own fragility, of the immense, untamable power of the sea. It's no wonder that these sailors were a superstitious lot. They saw signs and omens in everything. The flight of an albatross, the color of the sunset, the appearance of St. Elmo's fire dancing on the mast during a storm. They believed in ghost ships, like the Flying Dutchman, doomed to sail the seas forever, and they believed in monsters. The maps of the era were filled with terrifying creatures lurking in the unexplored parts of the ocean. The Kraken, a squid of such immense size that it could pull an entire ship down to the depths. The Leviathan, a great sea serpent that could crush a hull with its coils. Were these just fantasies, or were they the feverish attempts of traumatized minds to give form to the formless terror of the deep? When you spend months on end in a state of fear and deprivation, staring out at an endless, empty expanse of water, and then, after months that felt like a lifetime, a cry from the lookout in the crow's nest, "Land ho!" the two most beautiful words in any language, a surge of unimaginable relief and joy would sweep through the ship. Men would weep, they would embrace, they would stare at the faint, hazy line on the horizon as if it were the gates of heaven. It was the end of the journey, the end of the suffering, or so they thought. The new world was not an empty paradise. It was inhabited, and the natives were not always welcoming. First contact was a tense, unpredictable affair, fraught with misunderstanding and the constant threat of violence. The sailors, weakened by their long voyage, were vulnerable. But they also brought their own invisible weapons, diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the native populations had no immunity. They would unleash demographic catastrophes without even knowing it. The search for treasure, for the fabled cities of gold like El Dorado, was usually a fool's errand. Instead of gold, they found dense jungles, strange and dangerous animals, and tropical diseases against which they had no defense. Many a sailor who survived the horrors of the ocean would meet his end in a malarial swamp or at the end of a poison. And even if the mission was a success, what was the reward for the common sailor? A pittance, a tiny share of the profits, most of which would be gone within a week of returning home, spent on drink and women in a desperate attempt to feel alive again. The great wealth, the spices, the gold, the glory fey that all went to the investors, the merchants, and the kings who had financed the voyage. The sailor was left with nothing but his scars, his nightmares, and the knowledge that he would soon have to sign on for another voyage, because it was the only life he knew. He was trapped in the cycle, so we look back at these voyages, at the lines they drew on the map, at the new continents they discovered. We see it as the dawn of a new age, the birth of our modern, globalized world. And it was a world built on a foundation of unimaginable. It was built by hundreds of thousands of nameless men who lived and died in floating hells. Their reality was not the glory of discovery, but the daily grind of survival. It was the taste of weevil-infested bread, the agony of scurvy, the terror of the storm, and the casual brutality of the boatswain's rope. The true legacy of the age of exploration is not just in the maps we have today, but in the echoes of the voices that were never recorded, the stories of the men who hauled the ropes and pumped the bilge. Their story is one of human endurance pushed to its absolute limit, a testament to the fact that for every celebrated hero standing on the quarterdeck, there were 100 forgotten souls suffering in the darkness below. That is all for today's video. If you like this video, thank you for watching, and see you next time.